I actually think some of the best biomechanists I've ever met uh, didn't love initially maths or physics, although it comes quite easily to them. But everyone who likes sport is really, by definition, a biomechanist. So if you've got a younger brother or sister or a child, and they're playing t-ball and they're swinging late or something, naturally to move their hands up the bat so they'll swing. Naturally to do that. I just get to teach you the fancy words for it, which is, you're just reducing the moment of inertia, but everyone knows what to do. So I actually think everyone is a biomechanist. We like all professions, we like to have our own language that makes us feel special. I like to pretend that we're really not special at all and that everyone could do what I do.
Hey techies, we're back with another episode of Tech Society. Today we have Associate Professor Jacqueline Alderson. Jacqueline hails from the School of Human Sciences at the University of Western Australia and is a recognised expert in biomechanics. She is also an adjunct professor in human performance innovation technology at Auckland University of Technology. Jacqueline has over 140 peer-reviewed papers and conference proceedings and has supervised 22 PhD, 4 Masters and 45 Honours students to completion. Jacqueline currently leads research teams in the areas of innovation, wearable technology, artificial intelligence and big data analytics in sport and health.
Hi there. How are you both?
Yeah, good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good. Good. It's been a long semester.
I bet it has.
Let's just jump straight into the TED Talk, actually, which I watched, the TEDx talk. I watched that this morning. It was really good about the digital twins but it's not the digital twins that I know, which is the oil and gas industry.
Engineering physical twins, yeah.
So maybe we can just start with, what is it you do? How is it related to digital twins? And what is a digital twin from your perspective?
So hi, I'm Associate Professor Jacqueline Alderson. I work in the Faculty of Science at the University of Western Australia, and I work in the area of biomechanics, which is essentially how biological systems and structures respond to various sort of mechanical stimuli, generally from a mechanical or physics-based perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah.
So succinct. I like it.
Yeah. Sounds like you've said that a few times.
No, it's the first time I've ever said it like that, actually. So it's true. It's actually true. I kind of change it up every time because sometimes people go, oh, that's a bit weird. Okay. Anyway, so I probably should also say I also work in the area of technology with respect to wearable devices and sensors, and in more recent years in the area of large data sets and machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches to large data sets in the area of sport science and also health applications.
So I really love the concept of a medical digital twin. Like John said, we're very familiar. In fact, we've built full-scale 3D digital twins of mine sites and all, that kind of thing. I'd never actually thought of it in the context of a human, let alone from a medical perspective. So can you tell us a bit more what that looks like and where that's going?
Sure. And this is clearly a blue sky vision that we have with a range of research collaborators at the moment around Australia, but also the world. Mm-hmm. And so a human digital twin is, as you've just said, is essentially an in silico replica of a physical asset. And in this instance, we consider the asset to be the human body, but we consider that in all its scales, if you like, from the smallest genome all the way through to the outer shell and what you might consider the skin, and all of those physical assets in between, which we can obviously create through and merge through physical imaging. So that's the easiest part to start with, that physical mapping. But then clearly we're interested in how that performs out in the real world. So can we track that? Can we, for example, record information that might, in the longer term, from a long-term perspective, record things like the physical loads that are experienced by the body, and that will over a longer term give us information about things like osteoarthritis development, the actual loading parameters that humans experience through their activities of daily living and all of those sorts of things. So it's a really interesting area. I specifically work in the area of sports science with respect to creating digital athletes, but the applications are clearly endless. I work with teams which is digital soldiers, digital patients, which is really what you're referring to, because can we use it for rehabilitation? And ultimately, I mean, the holy grail of that is, for example, there's some great work across Australia by research teams out of UWA and also Griffith in this space, and Melbourne actually as well, where, for example, you might be walking around and your Samsung Gear watch or your Apple iPhone or whatever you're wearing will be able to real-time calculate the loads experienced, for example, through your Achilles tendon. And let's say you're trying to recover from an Achilles tendon injury if you're an athlete. And we know that there's a sweet spot with respect to that loading. So we know that if you load too little, the cellular matrix doesn't repair properly. And if you load too much, you clearly break down that repair. So there's this sweet spot of where we can actually load. And you can be walking around and with wearable devices, etc., we may be able to, or we will be able to calculate what that load on that tissue is, and then perhaps give you some biofeedback or haptic feedback to say, oh, you've loaded too much or you're underloading, to get optimal repair of that particular tissue. So from a health perspective, it clearly has significant application and personalised application for people. I'm particularly interested in it from a sports performance perspective, and clearly the Australian Institute of Sport is as well, and lots of our, because there's lots of rules now surrounding what you can do to external equipment in terms of influencing performance, and that external equipment like swimsuits, laser suits in swimming, or the bike in cycling, etc. There's only a small bandwidth of play in that technology that you're allowed these days. So what we have to do is now look at what the real asset is, which is in fact the individual. And being able to simulate that, having all of the parameters of that individual is really going to be game-changing. And certainly it's the long-term view of the AIS and the high-performance sports sector across Australia that's something we'd like to investigate.
It's a big interest to me. I shattered my ankle, and I'm still fairly certain that I'm not walking evenly on it 3 years later.
Yeah, so this asymmetry, and
yeah,
I mean that's pretty easy to detect. The challenge for us often is that if I got you to come into the gait lab, for example, here at UWA, you become so self-conscious and so self-reflective that you change the way you walk. We don't get a fair representation of what you're doing when you're in the lab versus what you're doing in the real world. And that's what we really want to know. We really want to know what you're doing when you're walking down to the local shops to get a litre of milk. Because that's when you're experiencing the most load in terms of the cumulative load effects across your normal day. It's not when you come down to the lab for an hour once every 6 months or once a year. That's not really often. So we call that ecological validity, and the ecological validity of in-lab testing is not ideal. So we're using technology now, which is obviously where we want to be able to try and understand those loads and those forces out in the real world.
There must be some pretty exciting technology in the sports world where there's real big return on investment, obvious return on investment. Yeah.
And if you think about the sports space at the moment, I work with a number of elite sporting teams through the AFL and Hockey Australia, the list goes on, Swimming Australia, etc. And what we do know is that in many respects the physical capacity gains are very marginal now, because the level of strength and conditioning and physical training, and by the exercise physiologists as well, is essentially getting close to ceiling in terms of what it is that we do know. So, those gains that they can make in those spaces are quite marginal in the context of, if you looked at generally, there'll be some, AFL diehards that would argue Richmond is one of the other clubs is much fitter than another club. And I think we have to not take the COVID year into account here. But I think what you see is there's the bandwidth of the fitness levels across the AFL of all players is fairly narrow. I think they're all fairly well conditioned. So the real opportunity now comes in other spaces. So it comes in how we use data, how we use mapping when they're on the field. Skill acquisition is also one, and that obviously has a huge role with respect to technology. Our lab, for example, has 3D stereoscopic. We did it much well before VR and AR became a thing. We spent 4 years developing a stereoscopic projection of players in the lab where people had to avoid them, because we knew when people had to avoid, we know that when people have to avoid individuals, their risk of an ACL injury, for example, triples. So there's a huge amount of cognitive processing that goes on, and visual processing that has a significant role in injury prevention. We particularly know this with ACL injury, which is an injury you do to yourself, as you were talking about before. If you watch that TEDx talk, you would see that I covered that a little bit. But we set up in our lab this projection mapping system where your teammates and opposition players are running towards you. You're running towards them. So we have two converging fields, a projected field and also a player who has a full mocap set up on. Also EMG, so we're recording muscle activation patterns. Also gaze tracking, and that gaze tracking is calibrated to the projection system, so we can see where on that projected play and where on the other players that person's looking. Because now it sounds fairly, in some ways, in today's sort of terms, it doesn't sound that complex, but when we first did this work nearly 8 to 10 years ago, it took us over 2 years to get that system fully integrated and synchronized. Because as you can imagine, when you have converging fields of view, things become, you're almost in a real-time calibration system process. So that was interesting, but it's definitely provided us with some insights to show that what we want to do is start to train people about where to look. Because if I can look at something and I get that milliseconds of time, pre-planning time, that allows me to kind of control and prepare my musculoskeletal structures in preparation for a load, that small amount of time saved, that actually can prevent or allow me to sort of mitigate against my risk of getting an ACL injury, for example. And so that's a really great example of something that we're trying to do in real time. And now what we're trying to do is integrate that with 3D pose and machine learning and all the things, so we can do this markerless tracking on a field and then estimate knee loads and estimate ground reaction forces and workload parameters that sports science practitioners and the medical staff associate with injury.
It's really cool because this is like applied data science as opposed to just ML for the sake of ML. But my question is, I guess if you're taking in an undergrad who was doing a project on sports science, in the TEDx talk you mentioned that data sets are getting extremely large and you need to start using machine learning and AI to be able to crunch through all the data. So how does the cooperation work with students from the data science side of things and majoring in data science? Do they come over to the sports science team and work together, or how does it work?
That's an excellent question, actually, John, and an age-old problem in universities sometimes, but something that we're working really hard to try and correct. This year, over the next 6 months, I will actually host a team of data science master's students from the computer science department, and we give them sets of data, sports-related data, and they're going to do a project with that and then provide some output. So there's this real linkage now of, in the past someone might have asked me for a data set. I didn't really have any involvement with the students in another part of the university, whether it's maths or statistics or computer sciences. And they didn't really have an understanding of what the data was. They just and there's this, and it's a really interesting problem. And I used this this example in a talk that I gave in Ohio last year, which was there's this real need for there to be translators and connectors between computer scientists and domain experts. And I personally feel like that is the area that no one's talking about right now, because people in my domain need expertise with respect to just simple understanding of what machine learning, for example, might be, which often we don't need to use it. Everyone thinks it's this magical thing. It's just really statistics on steroids.
Yes.
It's really all it is. And on the other side, we need computer scientists to have a better understanding of the domain-specific nuances and subtleties of the data that we've provided. And so I would argue that connector space is a real opportunity for people to upskill in both areas, and talk more about what it is that we want to do. So we're making a concerted effort across certainly University of Western Australia to link between, for example, life sciences, which is the area I technically work in, and across to maths and to statistics, but also strongly, I've worked now with the computer science team for about 10 years. And that was a purposeful decision on my part, mostly because I could see the value in what it is that they could do. I'd like to pretend it was great vision, but in some ways it was just good luck. That I just had started to get large data sets. And in biomechanics, the dimensionality of our data generally means it's quite large, certainly much larger than, tracking heart rates or even tracking GPS coordinates or the things that sports scientists would typically work in. I'm technically a bioengineer really by trade. So much of the work, much of the signal that we have is multidimensional and quite large. Still nowhere near as large as genomics people or anything like that, the square kilometre or astronomy, but certainly large enough to warrant linking up with the computer science team. And that in itself was a lesson in understanding people and communication. I think we went for nearly 2 years before I realised there was a little frustration to a certain extent. And then I realised, I think 2 years in, that what they called a kinematic model was different to what I called a kinematic model. And we simply had a nomenclature difference, and neither of us had realised it. And it immediately explained the dual frustration that both parties were having with each other. So I would say that 4 of my most recent graduates have all been co-supervised in computer science. And I work with a great professor there called Professor Ajmal Mian, who runs the Machine Learning Intelligence Group at UWA. And my last, in fact, PhD graduate is now the lead data scientist for the Houston Astros in Major League Baseball. So he got picked up within a few days of finishing, and off he went.
Baseball they're very big on this kind of thing, aren't they?
Exactly. And interestingly, he didn't go as a biomechanist. He got recruited as data scientist, and granted his background was in data science. So there is many of the students I think will probably start to attract into biomechanics soon will probably come across from engineering and computer science anyway, whereas I've just had to wait and find the right animal within the biomechanics science team that has a love of coding. Most biomechanists can code, but not to the level of a computer scientist. Most of our students, though, are now trained. I train all my students now in Python and R.
Oh, cool. Okay.
That's a requirement within the biomechanics group that you get that training within. And it holds you in great stead moving forward for your skills. Even if you chose not to work in biomechanics, everyone wants training in that. They also train in an introduction to machine learning within that unit as well. So all of that within a cognate area of biomechanics. So that's one of the ways to circle back on your question, John. That's one of the ways that we're linking sort of computer science and technology. And many of the biomechanists, for example, might be using accelerometry data or GPS tracking data that's on AFL players or those sorts of things, but they're leveraging off the skill sets within the data science, computer science community.
Before we continue this podcast, here's a message from our sponsor.
We believe that you can create art and beauty with technology. We think big. We move quietly. We are Ninja Software.
So as these biomechanics students slowly get exposed to data science. And after they graduate, are they going to be, are the majority of the students as graduates, are the majority of the graduates' roles in the future going to be in research and development? Is there, or is it mostly into industry, sports industry, and in optimizing athlete performance? What is the typical career path for the graduates of sports science?
Good question. For me personally, I have quite a mix. I have I've about 3 students in Major League Baseball, actually, at the Yankees and a few places. Also, Tennis Australia. Most of the institutes of sport have someone who's been trained out of UWA. But at the same time, we have graduates who have worked at Stanford and University of Massachusetts and La Trobe and Kern. So there's this real split between industry, Cricket Australia. They split between industry and also back across in academia. And actually, I think all students get the skills to be able to do any of that. They just tend to fall where they're interested. There are students with research positions as well at world-class research institutions around the world. A former graduate from the sports science course worked for a number of years at Stanford. So there's a huge opportunity in this particular space, but I'm very conscious when I train students that I don't train them to be the tennis person. I don't train them to be the football person. I train them to be someone with great broad skill sets. And those skill sets can go from sport to clinical application, to industry application, to mining application, to the resource sector. They basically end up with broadness of skill sets that allow them to go anywhere. So you don't get trained in a domain-specific context. You get trained as a human being who really tends to, you can almost have your own destiny and drive your own destiny if you like. I remember that PhD student, he came in as a mature age, out of the engineering sector, oil and gas resource, and was a computer sort of network engineer. And I said to him, okay, tell me exactly what you'd like to do at the end of your PhD. And whatever it is, just say it, dream the dream. What is it? He said, I'd like to work in Major League Baseball. And, 3 days after he submitted or whatever it was, he had a job at Major League Baseball. So nice. Even though we're at the most, one of the most remote cities on the planet, if you do the right work, you have the right background and you get the right training, I definitely think anything's possible. Mm. And I definitely think, the sports science community has now shifted markedly towards understanding the use of data and tech in that space. And sports scientists have been at the forefront of that kind of innovation as well. Particularly in Australia, with respect to things like accelerometers and GPS tracking and satellite systems for GPS tracking and those sorts of things.
I'm curious about sports science and its integration into physiotherapists and all that kind of stuff. So they often might give you advice on bend your knees, make sure you pick it up carefully. When new research and discoveries, best practices are done through sports science, the faculty at UWA. How is it shared with medical professionals in the industry?
Gee, you're pulling out the good questions, John, aren't you?
I'm just really curious. Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's great actually, and they're exactly the right questions that people in the general community want to know as well. So I'm also quite lucky, for example, over at physiotherapy in the School of Sports Science, we have a number of former graduates from this school, and there are a number of my former students that now are on faculty, for example, over at Curtin. But I think ultimately what we're talking about is it's not and I want to give sports scientists probably a bit of a high five on this count. I don't think that we're that typical academic group that people are quite critical of, which just publish in journals that people don't get to see and move forward. Yeah. Our entire discipline is predicated on the fact that we get out there and talk to people, and we get out there and engage and actually translate what it is that we know to the real world, whether that be at a local community level or with children with coordination disorders, or to improve performance in children with coordination disorders, or, for example, work at an elite level with high performance sport. I think we almost have no choice but to get out there and do that. Otherwise, we have no discipline. And I think that's slightly different. With respect to the medical community and physiotherapy, there is, to a certain extent, a bit of a quid pro quo in the sense that they probably need to meet us halfway and be interested in the work that we do. But also we have to we're all busy people, but all of us are busy though. So we also have to get out there as a society and a group of professionals, as not just biomechanists, but sports scientists more broadly, and make sure we engage with those other practitioners. I think we engage the community very well. But perhaps you could argue it's a slight downfall that we don't get out and talk to, like-minded and sometimes not like-minded practitioners, because that's the only way you often can advance thoughts and ideas and theories and practices in the real world, really.
You mentioned working with elite sports people. Just to go real trivial, who's your favorite sports person you've worked with?
Oh, there's been quite a few, but easily, and probably just because of the tenure in terms of the length of time I've known him, would have to be Murali, the cricketer. So for many, many years, I conducted the illegal action testing in cricket here at UWA, and he's possibly the nicest man on the face of the planet. So, and I've known him for close to 20 years now, or longer, 25 years. That's showing my age now. But I'd probably say Murali. There's lots of great people though wandering around in sports, and I've also met some really fantastic sports scientists, high performance managers, people like Jason Webber at the Fremantle Dockers. There's Glenn Stewart at West Coast Eagles. There's lots of great people wandering about. And Australia is, very, very lucky. It is awash with people of talent. We've been known for decades to create not just great sports people, but actually have some of the world's finest sports scientists. And there's a reason that they're highly sought after in, Major League Baseball or English Institute of Sport Systems, and you will find them everywhere. We go out and we multiply, and we're in demand, and I think that's a testament to the entire sports science system of Australia.
What about the Olympics? And is there a lot of work that you've done with Olympians and giving Australia the extra edge it needs to win in the Olympics?
We haven't done a huge amount, and biomechanics is tough when it comes to in some ways we have to say, we think this might work. Give me this elite athlete for 6 months and I'll change their technique, and then we'll test if it works or not. And then perhaps if it doesn't, you might not be angry with us. So that's clearly not an avenue that's acceptable to the elite sports system.
It's not a good proposal, yeah.
No, it's not. Which is why technology is about to play a really increasing and important role in this space. Now that we have the capacity to do this near real-time simulations of techniques and performance. I have worked in Swimming Australia, and we've done things like computational fluid dynamics models to look at technique changes. And I remember I wasn't involved in this particular student, I was involved in his work after this, but I understand a number of years ago, it's a gentleman called Matt Keys, who was actually also a swimmer but an engineer as well, who specialises in fluid dynamics. He did his PhD in swimming. It took, I think it was the supercomputer that we had at the time, over 2 weeks to run a CFD model on a single arm stroke of a freestyle swim. So I think there was something like 16, don't quote me on this, but something like 16 million faces that were, and you actually then have to also calculate that in dynamically moving water plus air, because you're on the surface. So very, very difficult. And then deformable bodies, you're talking about skin and all of those sorts of things. And then the shape is deforming through human motion. So every frame is deforming as well. So it's a very difficult proposition. But with this is really where data and data science can come into its own, because we can start to utilise that, leverage off of the learnings of models, for example, and then use those weightings in something like this. And I this is going to change the face of the discipline moving forward over the next 5 years, I think. There's a reason Facebook have an entire musculoskeletal modelling team.
Really? Wow,
Yeah.
I did not know that.
What for?
Yeah. What evil?
Yes, say that.
Well, we're probably on the same page, Alex. Yeah.
What are they doing with it? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's the real question, and that has to be the question for biomechanists. What are they doing with it? Facebook, for example, Amazon, all of them are bidding for sports, and they're bidding for sports not because they want the broadcast rights, but because they want the data.
Wow, that's.
There's a whole range of reasons. So that the musculoskeletal modelling team you would see it as just making avatars for gaming, but they've created skeletal models that sit inside those avatars. That's a real concern. They want that data, and they want that data for a reason. And so they're unregulated in this space. And from myself, that's something that's extremely concerning. That they're the largest companies in the world, currently unregulated, and they want your data, and they want your physical data. And I think we're entitled to know what they want that data for.
I agree. I think that applies to all the data they sit on.
Exactly.
And that there is absolutely a data war going on between the large tech companies to see who can stockpile the most data.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say Google and Facebook are probably winning, but I had no idea they were even doing biometric modeling.
Well, I had no idea that they were doing musculoskeletal modeling either until it got sent to me, and I'm happy to share. I'll share it with you if you like, and you can put the links up if you can. But the first time I saw it, my stomach dropped for the longevity of my own profession.
So, okay, now this is an interesting one.
Yeah, sorry. What do you mean? What do you mean by?
Yeah. So, in addition to what Alex just said, what's the end game here? What do you feel is the end game for this?
Well, and they have great resources at their disposal, don't they? So, yes. One of our own competitive advantages that we have right now, for example, Australian sport has a database, not just a database, but a treasure trove of data related to elite athletes. And that's probably their only competitive advantage over Facebook, because Facebook can't, no matter how much money you throw at it, they can't go and find 12 elite javelin throwers over the world from the, in the last 20 years. You can't create elite athletes to collect data on. So there's this history. So the only thing that works to our advantage right now is the time capsule of the fact that we've been in the game longer. And we have data collected. You can't make up elite data, and you certainly can't synthesize it. So those people have to exist. We have that data. The real challenge now is how do we protect that from marauding groups of data pirates like the large tech companies who want that data from us, because that's really a competitive advantage for Australia. That's how I view it, and certainly I suspect that's how the Australian Institute of Sport view it. It's really an asset, and it's really something that belongs to the public of Australia. So in my mind, we need to be quite careful about even where we store data and where we store the privacy of athlete data and human data, whether it's just athlete or even you and I putting our information on Facebook, etc. So there's privacy components, but there's also rights components. If you think about it, there's really no rights for elite professional athletes. The moment they sign a contract with a professional sporting team, every single thing that they do, in fact, belongs to someone else. And there's some real concerns about that when you think about the regulatory effects of that. And I was thinking, someone asked me for an example the other day, and I think a really interesting one is something like, if you think about the number of knocks that a footballer of any code experiences, today those subconcussive knocks may not be, or impacts, they may not have any medical ramification. But 20 years from now, they may have considerable medical ramification. And if you're an insurer and you can get access to that data, that might determine whether you decide to insure that individual for health insurance moving forward. and there are no protections for those players with respect to who gets access and who gets exposure to the kind of data that we, because there's this rush to collect data. There's this, it's almost like there's this waterfall of, which I see in the background of John's screen there, there's this waterfall of data and we can take all of it and we can collect. And there's this attitude of, if we can collect it, we will. Mm-hmm. But there's no real thinking about what that means for people, for clubs, for society at large. And I think we possibly need to have a stop and a think about that.
The point you make about insurance companies is a really, really important one. And I have a suspicion that we are not aware of the data metrics they're gathering and analyzing. And the banks have already demonstrated what they will do. I think if you order too many Uber Eats, they may deny your home loan. These companies are absolutely going to use any data point they possibly can to reduce the amount of risk and increase their profits.
And in doing so, minimize you to a data point. And
absolutely.
We're all more than a data point. And I work in data and I advocate for data, and you've heard me advocate for what the common good that we can do with it. But we need to be mindful that what we're doing at all times is for the public interest and it is for the common good, because the data is yours. And that's something that in recent years I've become very mindful of, and I have a really strong relationship with the law school here at UWA, and we're looking at that. We're in fact about to start a project in that space with the Australian Institute of Sport, we're looking to, which is about investigating sort of best practice, regulatory underpinnings and best practice guidelines for how we treat data. So rather than wait for governments and policymakers and everyone to catch up, let's continue to keep sort of Australia at the forefront of best practice and set some really interesting goals, and not just interesting, but just really thinking through what this means for the Australian athletic population, professional sport population, but also what that means for amateur level non-sporting organisations as that flows down through to community level sport. Because, you set the bar when you talk about elite sport, but what people don't realise is whatever you set there is actually also what filters down at the community level. And we have to be super mindful of that, I think.
What does the future look like? I know it's a super open-ended question.
I'm not a futurist, so I dare to say, I'd say...
that's why I think your answer will actually want a bit more water.
Yeah, I'm not a futurist, is probably my answer. I think the future has many different possibilities and I'm excited for it, but I believe the future, we need to think about what the future is telling us if we don't change course and we don't stop to think. I think the future contains much coffee in order to make some really mindful changes of direction, but I'm very clear that there is a tackle is required, and that tackle is required on lots of fronts. To use a sports science analogy or sport analogy, we need to tackle the tech titans with respect to the data that we collect. We need to tackle our own discipline to think about why are we collecting that data and the tech that we're using. Is it necessary, or are we just doing it because we can and they're great toys and they're fun? What does it mean for the individual? And I think that the future, from a future lens, I think the opportunities are almost quantum in the context of there can be many. And I'm hopeful and optimistic that we will regain some of that power from the path that we're currently on and redirect it into tech and data that's much more focused in the public interest, and for me personally much more focused in for the sporting community in a way that is good for an individual, good for sport and good for the Australian populace.
Brilliant. Yeah, that was a great answer.
Great, yeah.
yeah, really, really good answer. What's your advice to that young person who's just about to graduate high school and they love sports and they love linear algebra?
come and be a biomechanist, wow, or a computer scientist or a data scientist, or but that's sport and motion often is the great leveler. Everyone likes it, and generally more people do than don't, probably a fairer statement. I didn't, and also don't panic too much. I think there's all this pressure to make the right decision. I started in an arts degree before I did science. And I did philosophy and politics. I think it makes me a much better scientist. You can change your mind, and that's okay. But if you love maths and you love physics, or even if you don't, but you love sport, I actually think some of the best biomechanists I've ever met didn't love initially maths or physics, although it comes quite easily to them. But everyone who likes sport is really, by definition, a biomechanist. So if you've got a younger brother or sister or child, and they're playing t-ball and they're swinging late or something, naturally to move their hands up the bat so they'll swing. Naturally to do that. I just get to teach you the fancy words for it, which is, you're just reducing the moment of inertia, but everyone knows what to do. So I actually think everyone is a biomechanist. We like all professions, we like to have our own language. That makes us feel special. I like to pretend that we're really not special at all and that everyone could do what I do.
Brilliant. Well, we won't keep you for too much longer. That was a really good answer, by the way, for the young people, especially not to panic.
Yeah, I think there's all this pressure, isn't there, to get it right, and you don't have to get it right. It's okay to take your time.
I did, so.
Yeah, you change and you find your way, and but I probably should have said, though, I also do believe one of the most important things is to do what you're passionate about. Don't do what's expected, do what you're passionate about. Anyway, right. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
It really has. Thank you so much for talking with us.
All right, Tim. Lovely to chat to you both. Thanks so much.
Thank you. See you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
That's the end of this episode of Tech Society. Speaking with Jacqueline has brought to light the cool applications of statistical compute in unexpected areas. The applications of machine learning to sports science and biomechanics was fascinating to learn about, as well as the risks involved in tech globalization, which result in exposure to large, well-funded data guzzlers like the tech giants of today. This episode was sponsored by Ninja Software, an entrepreneurial software company that thinks big and moves quietly. Ninja Software executes high-risk, high-concept, high-value software products. Check them out at njs.dev.